I always like to begin a chapter when possible and put it in a broader perspective that we've been talking about regarding human history. So most of human history, we've been having to deal with diseases. And so hunters and gatherers were dealing with all kinds of various parasites, insects, pests, microparasites. And then over time, as they migrated and went to new places, they would fight off certain parasites, or they would evolve or adapt, or they would just essentially move to areas in which parasites weren't a problem. And so over time, hunters and gatherers kind of evolved to fight off a lot of these pests and parasites, but nonetheless, it caused the population to really never grow because a lot of people were dying from these pests. But anyway, one other way in which people were dying was violent deaths. So violent deaths in which you come in contact with other hunters and gatherers and start beating the hell out of each other and die that way, or from animals. And so animals were actually much more of a burden, much more of something that would attack humans than, of course, in more modern times. As different groups of humans transitioned from hunters and gatherers to farmers, they began settling larger groups in villages and cities, typically in fertile river valleys. These initial clusters of settlers in different areas brought about new diseases for humans to have to deal with that they didn't have to deal with when we saw the hunter and gatherer era. So larger settlements overwhelmingly were focused on agricultural production, thus the first agricultural revolution. This meant that over time, more sophisticated irrigation techniques were developed to only make the agricultural productivity even higher, even greater. And so what they would do is they essentially would move the flow of rivers, and they would channelize that flow into man-made little ditches that essentially would be used to fill a lot of the fields with even more water and nutrients. And so what this would do, this was great, but what this did also was increase the amount of standing, stagnant water that was in these settlements. So what would happen is in waterborne diseases, a lot of parasites, a lot of bacteria absolutely love slow-moving, stagnant water. For example, mosquitoes. They absolutely love stagnant water. And so this then introduced new diseases as these waterborne diseases were then transferred to humans. Further, we have the domestication of animals at this time. And so now you have a lot of diseases that animals used to always have exchange with each other, would kill them, now being exchanged to humans as we became in closer contact with them. Further, we also have larger settlements, and so you have people living together. And so what this is going to do is it's going to create a situation where people have to poop and pee. And so what do you do with the waste? Well, this is still stuff they're trying to figure out in these early settlements. And so that became another source of a lot of diseases. And so essentially the first agricultural revolution, what it did was it created a lot of these widespread diseases that could wipe out a large amount of area. And so a large amount of people. And so we had to think about all these people living together, all these different diseases now that are brewing in these settlements, and then exchanging with each other. They could quickly then spread via contagious diffusion from one person to the next. Thus, you're going to have rapid declines in population. So these different diseases kind of were these natural ebbs and flows that stopped the population growth or slowed it when we think about the agricultural productivity that it would produce more and more and more food, but at the same time these settlements had a lot of diseases that impacted and caused widespread death. We're just going to look at 4 specific examples of these different diseases that rapidly spread through an area and just wiped out a lot of population. And these 4, we're going to focus in on at the latter part of the first agricultural revolution, more closer to modern times. And we'll just look at 4 examples of major examples of rapid wipeouts of population. There's several different examples of different cities and different areas that were just wiped out from a particular disease. And a lot of this is still one of those situations where historians are still trying to figure out. It's not like people knew what was happening. In fact, a lot of people thought maybe it was just divine intervention, that a higher power said, this is your time. And so a lot of this was still, not stuff that was written down, which people were saying, oh, this is an observation. So this is, for the most part, stuff that's having to rely on a lot of historical records, with the first example being there in Athens, Greece. And so, like I said, this isn't just the only example this time. There's several different examples as we see in this first agricultural revolution. And so during the 430 BC, so just about 2,500 years ago, about 1/3 of the population in Athens wiped out from a particular infectious disease. But that's nothing as far as the widespread and the large geographic spread of the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague is essentially this disease that circulated from fleas that are essentially laying and interacting with small little rodents or rats. And I'm not going to go into the whole nuances of that. But essentially how it spread was as the empire, and where it spread particularly there in what we call the Byzantine Empire. And so this was the Mediterranean area. And so southern Europe, part of the Middle East, northern Africa, where present-day Turkey was the headquarters for this empire. And so essentially there's where it was the most devastating. But as people then traded goods, as people moved from one place to another, from one port to the next, they essentially brought with them these rats, they brought with them these insects and diseases. And so this disease quickly spread, and upwards to about 25 million people were wiped out. And so these are early examples of network diffusion. As you then transported goods, as you interacted with these goods, as you opened these items, oh, this cool, this is great, this is from 100 miles down the road, I'm so happy to have this gift. But that gift would also potentially bring with it this disease. And so when we think about this particular bubonic plague, it was a 200-year period of just a large amount of deaths throughout much of this particular area of the world. Then came a recurrence of those pesky rats and their insects and the plague. And so the plague essentially came back again. And so this happened in the 1346 to 1353 period, a shorter period, but we're talking a massive amount of deaths during that small period. And so the Black Death, essentially what we have now is the Silk Road, which was connecting China all the way up with Europe. And so all places in between essentially were devastated by those pesky little rats and their fleas. And so what we have going on here is the spread, so once again network diffusion. And so where this was really most impactful, not so much in China, although massive amount of death toll there, but overwhelmingly there in Europe. And so Europe, about a third of the population, some have said 75 to 200 million people wiped out from this particular spread of this particular disease. And so this left major changes, massive amounts of changes. There's a huge amount of population that was lost from this particular small amount of time as far as this disease. As you recall, 15 to 20,000 years ago is when humans first came to the Americas. And so when they migrated and then settled and civilized different areas, essentially they then grew resistant to different parasites, different pests, and they essentially adapted over time. However, what was happening in what we call the Old World, or the Afro-Eurasian zone, or just essentially Europe, Africa, Asia, what was happening there was over time all those different civilizations were interacting with each other. You had the agricultural revolutions, much more in depth there, and it was the origins. And so essentially domestication of animals, over time humans living each other. So over time we didn't essentially develop resistance to diseases in the Afro-Eurasian zone. Then flash forward to the age of exploration. So we've already talked about that beforehand. And they call this the Columbian Exchange. It probably should be a better name than that, but anyway, we already have those names already done. But anyway, we have Christopher Columbus in 1492 sailed the ocean blue and came across and explored, was the first notable person that we think of as exploring the New World. And so essentially what happened was these individuals, these explorers, and then later the colonists, essentially brought with them their most powerful weapon, and that's disease. And so while in Africa, Europe, Asia, they developed resistance to different diseases, they then carried those diseases across the Atlantic Ocean via network diffusion, and then essentially decimated the populations here in the Americas. And so the Native Americans, or any indigenous group in the Americas, were absolutely decimated. When 90% of all indigenous populations, they believe, that were here beforehand were wiped out from just this particular spread of, for example, malaria. The big one was smallpox. These measles as well. These just absolutely devastated populations, and essentially made clearing and then claiming these lands much easier.